Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, as is Dani Ryan. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today we are talking all about the 1996 movie Thinner, which is based off of the Richard Bachman book of the same name from 1984, if I am not mistaken, and it's one that is certainly a little different from some of the other stuff that he's done, although more recently Elevation kind of follows a similar theme, but the storytelling itself is done in a much different way. But Dani, why did you want to discuss this movie? Is Thinner a book that really caught your attention at first, so you wanted to discuss the movie, or was it something with the movie that you just thought would be fun to discuss?
It's the movie itself. I watched it with my aunt a couple of years ago. There was a Stephen King marathon on and we watched it, and I remember just being like, this is really, really different from other Stephen King things that I've seen, but it also has sort of the same, aesthetic. There's this just very late 80s, early 90s kind of thing going on where I'm just like, it's comforting to me, but it is not good.
It really isn't, and I actually watched this, I want to say, somewhere around a year ago when it was on Hulu, because I noticed that it was going to be leaving the streaming service, and I was like, oh boy, I better watch this before it's not available anywhere, and then I'll have to pay to watch it, because I wasn't too sure about how much I would enjoy this, because I think by that point, I may have not even read the book. I'm not 100% sure on that. Maybe I had read the book just before watching it, but it was one of those things where I read the book and I was kind of like, how are they going to adapt this? And obviously a fat suit is the answer. So
you're not a good one either.
No. And you have several characters in this. For the most part, I would say a lot of the cast I wasn't super familiar with. I was kind of familiar with some of the more random characters, like you have Bethany Joy Lenz as the daughter Linda, but at the time she was only credited as Joy Lenz, and I was like, oh, well, I know her from One Tree Hill 8 million years after this movie. And then Joe Mantegna, whose name I probably just butchered, was one of the kind of gangsters in this, and as an avid watcher of Criminal Minds, I have seen him in many, many episodes of that, but otherwise, really, it's like Robert John Burke and Lucinda Jenny are your two main people who this story sort of centers around, and then you have people who come in like Michael Constantine as Tadzu Lemke, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Carrie Were as Gina Lemke. I probably just butchered 90% of those names, so my apologies to all of you. And it was something that the story was very small in a sense, but you still had several moving pieces to it.
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned, you didn't really recognize anybody, and I didn't either, other than the daughter. I was like, I know her from somewhere, but I'm not sure where. Whereas my husband walked through the room, and he goes, oh yeah, it's RoboCop 3 guy. So apparently, Robert John Burke played RoboCop in RoboCop 3, so the whole rest of the movie, I was just like, okay, wait, if I think of him as, B-movie Peter Weller, this kind of gets a little bit better. It's kind of fun.
See, I know him from Law & Order SVU because my mom watches that, and I just happen to walk in and I'm like, oh, that guy.
That guy. Yeah, the story is very slight, and then they try to make it last a little longer, because if I remember, it's like a novella. It's not a super long book, and so they try to add a little depth to it with extra characters and extra moving pieces, and it's just, it doesn't work. It's really disparate and confusing, and because of it, it loses momentum, and every time you feel like you're like, okay, this is going somewhere, then there's another side plot, and you're like, wait, what? Why?
Yeah, there's a whole lot going on that it doesn't really need, because it just distracts from the main part of the story, which is this sort of curse that makes this guy lose weight constantly. And you and I were talking briefly before we hit record here, and it's one of those stories that doesn't age super well either, because they use the term gypsy to describe this group of people, and that's a term that really is not used anymore. And obviously it's hard to fault Stephen King for words that were common at the time when he wrote certain things. But even as things get adapted years and years later, this isn't an adaptation that happened quickly. It took like 7 years or something ridiculous for this movie to even get made, from when it was an idea at Warner Brothers to it actually being released.
Yeah, it's hard because every single time they use that word, it's like I cringe a little bit, but I know that it's one of those things that at the time we weren't really talking about how that's not okay to say, and it's a lot. And the fact is the characters are very stereotyped. Like, the main traveler character is dressed like Esmeralda, basically.
Yeah.
And then the guy that casts the evil curse on him, he looks so interesting that they actually parodied it on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia when they did their Lethal Weapon 5. Danny DeVito is dressed exactly like the guy from this, like down to the denim vest that he's wearing. So that was kind of funny for me because I was like watching it this time and I was like, wait a second, that's where they got that from. That's kind of wrong.
Do you really think there are any likable characters in this story? Because for me, Billy was just so unlikable from start to finish. And, maybe Linda is a likable character.
I was going to say Linda. Yeah, Linda's the only likable character. There's a really great bit at the very beginning of the movie where she's talking to her dad about how he defends a mobster. And they do a lot of little like mobster back and forth jokes. And she's very charming and very likable. And I think, yeah, Linda's the only redeemable character in this entire movie. Like, everybody else sucks.
Which makes it hard to like the movie as a whole, too, because yes, there are movies that are dark and there are a lot of characters you don't like, but you have to have some sort of satisfying end, even if it's one that you can see coming and kind of crushes you. There are certain movies that end that way, but it's coming. So that at the end, you're not going to be happy necessarily. But with this, it was just a drag from what I remember. And to be honest, I don't remember a ton of the little details. So the reason I didn't end up rewatching this was because I was curious how much of it I would remember a year later, because a year isn't that long, really. And you have all these Stephen King adaptations that I've been watching, and I'm going to be very curious to see by the end of this podcast, or, as close to the end as I can get until Stephen King releases more books in like 3 years. But it's something that I'm intrigued to see how much I remember from certain adaptations because of the condensed time period that I'm watching them in.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing because there's stuff from Stephen King books and from some of the movies that it sticks with you forever. Like, there's little bits where you're like, that's stuck. Like, the guy sticking his arm in the garbage disposal in Firestarter. Like, that stuck in my brain and will be there forever. Whereas Thinner, like, no, most of what sticks is kind of goofy joke stuff. Things that I'm like, oh, that wasn't Always Sunny because it's that goofy, and the bad makeup, sort of just the very puffy fat suit, and then they just sort of deflated it, and so he just looks like he has too much skin, but it doesn't even quite look right then either. Like, there's a few good special effects in this, and so that's what makes that so frustrating too. Like, some of the like the one guy that's turning into like a lizard guy and his skin's all peeling off, that's nasty. They did a great job with that, but the Thinner makeup is not good.
I certainly remember the lizard thing because that's just something that kind of jars you while you're watching it. And I remember how absolutely disgusting it was to watch Billy eat, especially pie.
Oh, the pie and the chicken? Like, he grabs a whole rotisserie chicken and is just shoving it into his meat hole. It's so gross. Ugh. Yeah, this movie's gross more than it is. I mean, it's not scary at all. There's not a single scene where I'm like, ooh, that's scary. There's a bunch of times where you're like, ooh, that's gross, or ooh, that's unpleasant. But it's never actually scary because you're never actually worried about any of these people. You kind of are like, all right, let's see how horribly they die because they deserve it.
One of the interesting things about the Bachman books is I don't think any of the Bachman stories have really felt super scary to me, not in the way that you feel when you watch something like Pet Sematary or read something like Pet Sematary and It for the first time. And he just kind of shakes you to your core with certain things, especially, the original Pet Sematary. When you get that Zelda scene, you're just like, oh my goodness, like this is a lot to take in. And I don't ever want to see that character again. Thank you.
Yeah, it's exactly like some Stephen King stuff. Like I recently was watching the Stand TV series, which is not great, but it reminded me of all the things in the Stand that scared the crap out of me, and the disease in particular, Captain Trips and all that. And so to go from something like that, where there's this nuanced look at characters and people and how we act, and it's sort of this look at human nature, this is just a straight condemnation of everybody. And I feel like that's the problem with the Bachman books, is they're just so mean-spirited. There's no love for any of the characters. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of like, the world sucks, let me write about it.
The Long Walk, though, I think might be just scary from like a humanity perspective. You're just like,
that's my favorite.
Oh man, yeah, I think that would also be my favorite of the Bachman stuff, too.
Yeah.
And the only Bachman thing I haven't read yet is Blaze, because that comes much later, since that's sort of a after-death release, So it's one of those things where you're like, okay, all right, you have the Regulators and Blaze that come out after Bachman's supposed death, and you have to deal with those. But Thinner was really right around that time period when Stephen King was trying to make this alter ego work. And to have the movie be adapted over a decade later, that's a big gap too. So the fact that, this story maybe didn't stick with you to begin with when it released, for those who were reading all of his stuff and knew by that point who Richard Bachman really was, to then wait and get this adaptation, it really felt underwhelming too. And obviously I didn't have that decade-long wait. I had, maybe a few weeks or a few months tops, but just the story as a whole, I don't think it really popped as much as I was hoping on screen.
Well, and I remember the marketing for this. This is one of the first movies I really remember the marketing for, because I was like 5 or 6. I was pretty young. Let's see, 96. So I was like 8. And I remember going to the theater and seeing the posters, and the posters scared the crap out of me, because it's got, his face is normal on one side, and then on the other side it's all just skeletal, because he's thinner.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the previews on TV and things like that, and I was like, that's the scariest movie ever. So for when I saw it as an adult, I was like, that's it? That's all there is to this? Like, there is some really great gore stuff. Besides Lizard Guy, there's a couple of really gross deaths. There's some stuff between the battles, between the out-of-towners and the people who live in town. There's some really, really good stuff there, but none of it really matters because of the story. The story's just so weak, and the acting is so all over the place that you just can't get invested.
It's very over the top at times when it doesn't need to be, and you're like, okay, let's tone it down a little, please.
Well, and it plays everything straight-faced. It plays everything completely straight-faced, despite the fact that it is completely nutty. Like, there's never a little wink and a nod. There's never any acknowledgement or meta-awareness, anything. It's just sort of like, this is a very serious, scary story that we're telling. And I'm like, okay, is the moral to not be a dick? Because everybody in this is.
Yeah, and that makes it really hard to root for one side or the other, because a lot of times you'll have this good versus evil kind of thing going on. But at this point, it's like, I guess we'll call them the travelers because they're not from the area, but they come in and sort of cause all of this chaos and act like, everyone should be accepting of them and what they do. And then you have someone like Billy, who is sort of just a jerk all the time. So you have two unlikable parties, and they each blame each other for their problems, which are mostly self-created, it feels like.
Yeah, I feel bad for the travelers a little bit at the beginning. I'm kind of like, okay, I understand. Like, you just want to live your life and go on the outside of the town and do what you do and go with the circus and do your fortune telling thing, whatever. Like, I get that. Like, leave them alone. Don't be jerks. but they retaliate to such a point that it's just like, was that necessary? Like, why did you escalate it to, I'm gonna curse you into being skinny until you die? That just seems like overkill. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it's, again, like you said, it's hard to root for anybody. Like, nobody is likable and nobody's identifiable. That's a new word. But yeah, it's a tough flick, and I feel like there's some interesting stuff there. There's definitely some commentary that it's trying to make in places, but I think the King just was too bitter and disillusioned at the time to really pull it together.
Oddly enough, this feels like one of those stories that maybe might have benefited from more context, and you can see that as they travel, they're kind of leaving this path behind them of unhappy people. So you're kind of like, all right, we kind of feel bad for you, but at the same time, if you want to be left alone, why are you going to make things worse?
Yeah, and my husband mentioned that they're actually connected to the same travelers from Dr. Sleep, that at one point there was a theory that they were the same sort of group of travelers, and I was like, you know what, that could track. I could see that. I could totally see, like the hat and stuff just being like, hey, let's ruin this guy's life by making him super skinny no matter how much he eats.
And you certainly can't put something like that past Stephen King, because we've seen how he's created this interconnected universe. I'm reading Wizard and Glass right now, and it mentions Captain Trips, and I was like, okay, this is a little too real to be reading right now, but it was just a small piece, and we are going to carry on. And obviously I had been told ahead of time that The Stand is sort of a prequel to some of the Dark Tower stuff, so I was aware of that going in, but it was still interesting to see how he connected those two worlds together. And there's this crazy poster that I think I've mentioned on here before that just shows all of the connections to the Stephen King properties. And even if you put it up like full screen on your computer, you still have to zoom in to see everything because there's just so much. So I definitely wouldn't put that past him. But I want to go back a little to something you mentioned earlier, and that's the effects, because obviously the fat suit is a little too blown up and pudgy to actually look realistic, but I think they did do a nice job, like you said, with certain things like the lizard and just some of the practical effects that stood out more. But what did you think of how they made him look skinnier and skinnier?
I thought sometimes it worked, and sometimes I was just like, oh, you put liquid latex on him. Good job, guys. It works sometimes. Sometimes it just looks like skin that is sort of hanging there, and skin doesn't hang off your face like that, no matter how quickly you lost weight. Like, I feel like they could have consulted some things. Like, I know they didn't have Google back then, but there were encyclopedias. Come on, guys.
You could have called a doctor, you know?
Yeah, call a doctor. Get a medical expert and be like, what would happen if somebody lost weight this rapidly? Like, would their skin, hang off their face? No, you'd have a little around your neck, not on your face like that. Like, he's just got, like, little pieces of skin on his face, and it's just really unsettling, but it doesn't get the point across.
Yeah, I thought it worked on occasion, but for the most part, you were like, okay, I get what you're trying to do here, so we're just gonna carry on and try and ignore it.
We're just gonna roll with it, yeah. Like, it's like some of the early season Buffy vampires where you're like, I see what you're going for, but you could have toned that down about 3 notches and it still would have worked.
Absolutely. We can't talk about a Stephen King adaptation without bringing up a Stephen King cameo, because for the most part, they exist in a lot of these movies, and in this, he played Dr. Bangor, which I thought was kind of a nice nod to the area, because they actually did film this one in Maine, which obviously helps when you're telling a Stephen King story.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually shooting it in Maine and on location, that kind of thing helps. Yeah, Dr. Bangor, he's one of the more memorable Stephen King cameos. Like, usually he's just sort of in for like a half second, but he's got a good 15 minutes of screen time in this, because he's a major player in the very beginning, and he gets interviewed by the lawyers during the big case at the beginning. So he's wacky.
That probably has to do with the fact that they did film it in Maine, because it's probably pretty easy for him to just pop on over to where they're filming. And I believe he does have certain cameos where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And others where you're like, wait, where was he?
Yeah, there's somewhere he's there for like a half second. You're like, did he Hitchcock that one? Like, is he messing with us? And then this one, he's in it a lot. And it's a pretty fun one. He's not trying to do any kind of crazy accent or anything, so it's not bad. Yeah, Stephen King and Quentin Tarantino, the two of them need to learn. They cannot do accents and they need to stop.
Some good advice right there.
Yeah, Stephen King, Thinner. It's a movie. It happened.
Yeah, we're kind of struggling for things to say here, and I don't even think that necessarily has to do with the fact that I didn't rewatch it for this. I think even if I had rewatched it, there's not enough that sticks with me for it to have an impression. So I guess we can wrap this up in a moment here, but I like talking about ratings on here just because I think it's a fun way to see if I am on the same page relatively with my guests. So I gave this a 2 out of 5, and I had to go to Letterboxd and look that up because I was like, what did I rate this?
I gave it a 2.5, and I think the only reason I gave it that extra half was because I rated it as the Lizard Man scene was happening, and I was like, that still looks cool. Like, his face is falling off as he's driving, and that works for me.
One other last thing, so I lied a little bit here, but what did you think of the ending?
Oh.
Throw a curveball at you.
Speaking of nihilism and the world sucks and I hate everything Stephen King, that ending, yeah, he poisons his whole family. That's the ending. Yay, I guess.
Linda got the short end of the stick for sure this entire movie, and it's very, very sad to see.
Yeah, it's a bummer. Like, it's up there with like a Serbian film in terms of endings where you're just like, why did you go that bleak? Was that necessary? Or like the original Clerks, like where Dante gets killed. Like, why did you do that to us? And then the movie ends and you're like, I sat through an hour and a half for that? You jerk.
Thankfully, it was only an hour and a half. The adaptations keep getting longer and longer these days, so we'll see how those age.
Oh my god, imagine a 3-hour Thinner. Imagine 3 hours of Thinner.
No, thank you.
Ooh, that would be rough. That'd be like harder to watch than Cats, maybe. That's not true.
I have not seen Cats, so I cannot speak to that at all. But I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that's good. That's smart. I made it 30 minutes. It is an abomination unlike which I've ever seen.
Well, I think that wraps things up. Dani, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Thinner today.
Thank you. Anytime.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show for $2 a month. I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.